Buenos días a todos, sean bienvenidos a la última conferencia del ciclo Lenguaje y Predicción. Good afternoon in the UK if you are with us. And it's a pleasure to have Hugh Rabagliati. Did I pronounce Rabagliati correctly? More or less, okay. I pronounce your name in the Spanish way. So how it is?
Rabagliati.
Okay, so more like an Italian way. Okay, thank you for being here. Dania will introduce us to our speaker.
Buenos días a todos. Welcome, Dr. Rabagliati. It is a great pleasure to have you here today in this cycle of conferences, Language and Prediction. Before giving you the floor, I would first like to share with our audience a summary of your profile in Spanish. El Dr. Rabagliati obtuvo su doctorado en psicología por parte de la Universidad de Nueva York en Estados Unidos y posteriormente realizó trabajo postdoctoral en la Universidad de Brown y la Universidad de Harvard. Actualmente es profesor en el Departamento de Psicología en la Escuela de Filosofía, Psicología y Ciencias del Lenguaje de la Universidad de Edimburgo en Reino Unido, universidad en la cual también está a cargo del laboratorio de RAPLab. Sus líneas de investigación giran en torno al desarrollo del lenguaje y la psicolingüística. En específico, le interesa investigar sobre los mecanismos y representaciones mentales que las personas, en particular los niños, usan para convertir conceptos e ideas en palabras y oraciones. De igual manera, investiga cómo estas habilidades se ven afectadas por trastornos del desarrollo, como la esquizofrenia. Para estudiar el lenguaje, usa diferentes metodologías de la psicología del desarrollo y la psicolingüística, tales como el rastreo de la mirada, ejes, entre otros. Además, el Dr. Rabagliati cuenta con múltiples publicaciones en revistas de alto factor de impacto y ha colaborado con investigadores de diferentes países. A continuación, el Dr. Rabagliati nos presentará la conferencia titulada Learning to Predict versus Predicting to Learn. La ponencia tomará aproximadamente 40 minutos y posteriormente tendremos entre 10 y 15 minutos para preguntas y comentarios por parte de nuestro auditorio. Pueden publicar sus preguntas en español o inglés directamente en el chat de YouTube y nosotros se las comunicaremos al doctor. Dr. Rabagliati, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to, well, not be there, but be talking to everyone today. Particular pleasure to see Natalia. Natalia was a PhD student at Oxford when I was an undergraduate in the same lab. And I do not think I was the best undergraduate of all time, so I apologize for that, Natalia, now. Anyway, I'm excited to talk to you all in beautiful Mexico City, and to tell you a little bit about a project that we've been working on for many years on the relationship between learning and prediction and children's language development. Before I start, I just want to thank a couple of people, in particular, Chiara Gambi, who's now an assistant professor at Warwick University in the UK, and Martin Pickering, who's my colleague at the University of Edinburgh, and our funders who helped us do all this work, and all the families who sort of helped contribute data. So when humans interact in conversation, we go through this fast-paced exchange of information that involves an array of different informational channels, but we seem to accomplish it more or less effortlessly. So hopefully what you can see on your screen right now, maybe a little bit laggy because we're online, is two people having a conversation in British Sign Language. And what you can see is that the exchange of information seems seamless. There's no pausing to understand what someone says. There's just a lot of interjections and transmission of information to or fro. There's nothing slow here. This is fast-paced and it's rapid. And our success in this sort of fast-paced, rapid interaction, to a large degree, is now understood to be underpinned by prediction. So the ability to predict upcoming linguistic material. And during the sort of early to mid 2000s, there was an awful lot of evidence produced for this skill at prediction. So for example, classic eye tracking work showed that when you listen to sentences, you move your eyes towards pictures that you think are predictable from the context and are likely to be mentioned next. So you might, if you hear the sentence, "the man will drink," you might look towards a full glass of beer. work on eye tracking while reading showed that the time you spend fixating a word in context is highly predictable by the predictability of that word in its sentential context. So prediction affects how long you look at a word in order to understand it. And neuroscientific evidence suggests that the brain produces mismatched responses to words that are unpredictable in context. And these mismatched responses can be in terms of the semantic features of the word, so whether its meaning is incongruous in context, but it can also be in terms of more basic perceivable features of a word. So if a word does not look like the sort of word you're expecting, even if its meaning is really similar, you get a visual mismatch response. So lots of evidence that we predict a lot, and we predict in detail. And this sort of evidence that for the role of prediction and how humans understand and use language as adults is sort of consistent with a broader predictive turn in the cognitive sciences that sort of place prediction front and center as an explanation for human cognition. And this is a sort of, to some degree, a recent term, but it has older roots, right? So if you think about theories of reinforcement learning and animal learning, like the Rescorla-Wagner model, there's an important role for generating predictions in that type of theory. If you think about neural network models, say recurrent neural network models from back in the 1990s or the late 1980s, and more modern formulations of these, like long short-term memory networks, these also rely on prediction in order to learn about or process the world around them. But the big sea change for the role of prediction in cognitive science came about with the emergence of a set of theories that are usually labeled with the term predictive coding. Right, so predictive coding theories make the claim that in order to perceive the world around us, we're constantly generating predictions about what we're going to hear, what we're going to see, what we're going to feel, what we're going to taste. And then we interpret the world by the degree to which the sensory response to our environment mismatches with those expectations that we were generating. Right, so you're generating predictions, you're getting a mismatch to determine the difference between your expectations and reality. And that's how we perceive the world. And this idea of predictive coding began in sort of fairly niche areas of computational vision, and has sort of expanded to become a sort of general purpose framework by which many people suggest that we might understand how the brain processes the environment. And it's led to some sort of some claims that I think perhaps might be a little marginal. So one of my colleagues over at the University of Glasgow a few years ago released a press release announcing that the theory that the brain is predictive may even be as important for our understanding of the mind as the theory of evolution. So an awful lot of exuberance and excitement about the idea that the brain is predictive. And sort of just to clarify, you know, the basic idea of predictive coding as a theory of perception and cognition is sort of kind of nice. It's pretty simple. You generate predictions, you calculate the errors that you get from the sort of stimuli that you're actually seeing, the degree to which they mismatch with what you're expecting. And then from those little error signals, you can re-specify your model, generate new predictions. And that's how we come to have a stable perceptual state when you're looking at, say, a word in front of you on a page, or when you're looking at an object down the road. And hopefully what you can also see here is that this is not just a theory of perception and cognition, it can also be sort of reconsidered as a theory of learning and development as well. So if you want to think about what role prediction might play in language learning, well, if you're a little child trying to learn about the meanings of words, for instance, you might generate predictions about what labels people are going to use in order to name particular objects. Then, when your predictions are right, or when your predictions are wrong, you can update your model in turn, and so hopefully you generate slightly better predictions next time until you've optimized your internal model of how people use language in order to precisely predict what people say at all points in time. And this idea that language learning involves creating this predictive model of language is something that people have suggested in a number of domains at this point in time. So this is a paper by Morten Christensen and Nick Chater, where they argue that language learning involves creating a predictive model of how people use language using exactly this process of online error-driven learning. This beautiful circle, generating predictions, calculating errors, and respecifying. And if this is true, it's a beautiful thing, because it suggests that prediction can really act as a unifying theory, right? We have prediction as a unifying framework to explain not just how we as adults engage in conversations or perceive the world around us, but it can also explain how it is that little kids, little babies eventually learn to understand their language, if it's true. What I'm going to do over the next sort of 30 minutes or so is try to sketch out an alternative way in which prediction can help children to learn. This is perhaps a less exciting account, perhaps an account that is maybe not as sexy, but I think it's an account that might be closer to being correct. And this alternative view of prediction is that prediction in itself is not a core mechanism for learning, but rather it's something that supports us learning about our environment. So prediction in this case isn't a learning tool. It's a catalyst. It's something that allows us to more easily integrate information from a world that is messy and confusing. So consider a sort of classic language development task where you are trying to figure out the meaning of a word that your parents are using. You don't know the meaning of that word, but you hear it in a sentence when you're cooking with them. They say something like, "Can you go over there and get me the DAX?" Now, for a child to be able to understand what DAX might mean in this situation, they have to do a whole bunch of different things. They have to, understand the visual and auditory environment that they're in. They have to think about what the parent might be referring to in the room around them. They have to understand the rest of the sentence that the word DAX was a part of. So there's a whole bunch of different tasks that a child needs to perform before they can even get to the sort of basic question of, well, what might DAX mean in this particular scenario? And that's going to be difficult if your ability to process this information is to some degree slow. And it's going to be made really easy if you're a good predictor. Well, not going to be made easy. It's going to be made easier if you're a good predictor who is able to some degree to pre-process information about the world by generating accurate expectations about what the adult around you is likely to say. So under this view, prediction is a catalyst. It's not a mechanism itself. It's something that facilitates other learning mechanisms operating. So if you remember your high school chemistry, I think I roughly do, a catalyst is something that lowers sort of the energy requirement for a chemical reaction to occur. So you have a bunch of reactants, and at a particular temperature, sometimes they react together, sometimes they don't. And basically a cascade of chemical reactions can't occur. And then a catalyst is another type of molecule that when it is in that environment, it lowers the energy or heat requirements for the reaction because the reactants bind to the catalyst, and that brings them close together, and then they can bind to each other, creating a new molecule. And then they can leave the catalyst, and the catalyst is unchanged, right? The catalyst hasn't really done anything. It didn't cause the reactants to bond to each other. They wanted to do that anyway, but it just, it helped them to bond to each other. So prediction might be the same sort of thing. It's something that lowers the energy requirements for learning to occur. It lowers the demands that interaction with the outside world places on our attentional system, on our memory system, on our language processing system. So these are the two theories of prediction and learning that I'm going to try and talk about today. So this idea that prediction itself is a mechanism for learning versus the idea that prediction is a catalyst that helps us to learn. And I'm going to do this by asking 3 questions about children's ability to generate predictions. I'm going to ask, how do children generate predictions and exactly what are they able to predict? I'm going to ask what information children actually predict in terms of the particular characteristics of linguistic information. And then we're going to sort of more generally see how children's prediction skills relate to their subsequent language development. So part one, how do children generate predictions? When we began this project about too many years ago now, there was already a fair amount of evidence that by the time children were 2 to 3 years old, they were able to generate linguistic predictions. So Nivi Mani and Falk Hertig over in Germany had shown that if you give 2-year-olds a simple sentence like the boy eats the big, then they'll gaze towards a cake rather than a robin before the word cake is mentioned. Ariel Borowski out in the United States had shown that if you give kids a sentence like the pirate hides thee and you track their eye movements around a set of pictures on a screen, they'll gaze towards the pictures that are most predictable given the context that they've heard so far. So when you hear the word pirate, you start looking to boats and you start looking to treasure. And when you hear the word hides, you start looking ever more towards pictures of treasure. So predictive eye movements in young kids. And the question is, well, what is driving these predictive eye movements? And there's two possibilities. One possibility is that a lot of these predictions are really just based upon associations, sort of lexical semantic associations. So when I say dog, you think cat. In a context where you hear the word arrested, maybe you think policeman, or maybe you think, robber or thief. Another possibility, however, is that predictions might be based also upon the structure of the sentence that children are hearing. And those previous studies weren't able to tell that apart. So if you hear the sentence, John arrested thee, then you know that police officers and thieves are both associated with the word arrested, but it's only the thief that is the typical patient of the verb arrested. Right, thieves are the things that are usually arrested. Police officers are the things that are the agents. They're the ones doing the arresting. So in this particular context, although police officers and thieves are both associated, only the thief should really be predictable if you can predict based upon the structure of your language. So these would be predictions based on a sort of syntax semantics view rather than just lexical associations. So the first experiment I'm going to tell you about examined the degree to which children can generate predictions based upon the sort of more grammatical structure. And we tested this by giving children a simple visual world paradigm task. So this is an eye tracking task where there's actually, these were real objects in front of them, right? They weren't just interacting with a computer, they were playing with a set of toys, and we were painstakingly coding their eye movements from a video camera after the fact. And children saw scenes like the ones that you can see here with Pingu, who's a famous penguin in the UK, and there would be a robber, and there would be a policeman, and then a distractor individual as well, in this case a nurse. And they'd either hear sentences with a predictive verb, like Pingu will arrest thee, and then they'd have to act out the rest of the sentence, or a non-predictive verb, like Pingu will touch thee. All right, so when you hear the word arrest, both the police officer and the thief are lexically associated, but only the thief is sort of structurally predictable in this context. By contrast, for the verb touch, there's no real difference in predictability between the police officer and the thief. And we examined children's gaze to the different objects before they heard the final word of the sentence, which would be the predictable word like thief. And we've got a set of adults doing this task, and we've got a set of kids doing this task as well. The youngest kids in this task were a little bit younger than 3 years, and they ranged up to about 5 years of age. And I've just lumped them all together because actually there wasn't a lot of age difference in how the children performed here. So let's look at the adult graph first so that we can sort of go through what we're looking at. On the x-axis, you've got the two conditions. So the non-predictive condition, that's touch, and the predictive condition, that's arrest. The light blue bar is gaze towards the police officer type figure, The darker blue bar is the robber figure. So under the non-predictive condition, you don't expect differences in gaze here. Y-axis here is the mean proportion of time spent fixating each of those two figures. And what you can see is that in the non-predictive condition, adults aren't generating anything predictive. In the predictive condition, they're focusing on the figure that is both associated and structurally predictable. So they're looking at the thief rather than the police officer. And if you cast your eyes over to the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that kids as young as 2 3/4, especially young 3-year-olds, they're doing exactly the same thing. Just like adults in the non-predictive condition, they're sort of looking across both objects equally, but in the predictive condition, they are gazing towards the object that is structurally predictable, not just lexically associated. And then we've got a control condition here as well, where we change this grammatical structure in which these verbs are embedded and show that that completely changes the degree of predictive eye movements that children generate. So in this control condition, we just ask them to show us touching or to show us arresting. And in this case, neither of the objects is structurally more predictable in this context. And so, in fact, children go to looking towards the police officer a little bit more. So it really seems to be the case that children are using the grammatical structure in which the verb is embedded in order to better predict which word is likely to be mentioned next. So, part 1. Children generate predictions about which words are going to be said next, or which topics are going to be mentioned next, based upon grammatical structure rather than just something simple like lexical associations. Next point. What information do children actually predict? So I've shown that children generate quite sophisticated predictions based on grammatical structure, but when they're predicting, what aspects of language are they actually predicting? And this is actually quite an important question for teasing apart the role of prediction error in children's learning. All right, so cast your mind back to that experiment by Nivi Mani and Falk Hertig that I mentioned earlier on, where children hear a sentence like "the boy eats the," and they look towards the cake. Well, what are they actually predicting here? Are they predicting that you're going to mention the word cake? Are they predicting that you're going to mention something with edible features and therefore they're looking towards the cake? Are they predicting something sort of broader, that it's going to be something non-animate? It could be a range of things that children are predicting here. However, if you're a predictive learner, then you really need to be generating predictions that are as detailed as possible, because that's going to be core to the task of learning about your environment, core to the task of learning about how people use language. And I think the easiest way to understand this is through a sort of classic example in language development, which is how we deal with overgeneralizations. Right, so you probably know that when kids are relatively young, they often overgeneralize. So they will say things like mouses rather than mice, or sheeps rather than sheep. And in order to overcome this type of overgeneralization using predictive learning, you need to be predicting that people around you are going to say things like sheeps or mouses, right? You need to be predicting that someone is going to say mouses when they say 3 blind. And then when you actually hear mice, a set of sounds that are different than the sounds you predicted, you can generate an error signal and you can learn from that. So your predictions do need to be detailed in order for predictive learning to be effective as a learning mechanism. So children generate these detailed predictions about the sounds of the words that they are going to hear next? We looked at this in the simplest way that we thought we would be able to measure and assess this, which is a sort of classic distinction in English, which is that the form of the indefinite article, a versus an, is predictive of the vowel onset or consonantal onset of subsequent words. So an apple, a car, right? So you can use the form of the indefinite article to predict the form of the word that you're going to hear next. And therefore, you should be able to predict, say, which picture is going to be mentioned next. All right, so in this study, we've got a set of adults, we've got a set of 4- and 5-year-olds, we've got a set of 3-year-olds, and we've got a set of 2-year-olds. We've got lots and lots of kids. So we have high power to detect an effect, even if it's relatively small. And children in this task saw 2 pictures on a screen, say an apple and a car, and they heard a carrier phrase like, can you see an, and then a little pause, apple, or can you see a, little pause, car. Right, so there's a lot of time, well, a reasonable amount of time, between hearing the indefinite article and hearing the critical noun that describes the picture that the child has to look at. And then we've got a sort of control condition here, which is, it's not really a control condition, it's a sort of matched condition, I suppose, where we're looking at semantic predictions based on the semantic content of the quantifier in front of the noun. So in this case, you've got 1 apple versus 2 cars, and you hear something like, can you see 1 apple? Can you see 2 cars? So you can use the number of the object in order to infer what's going to be mentioned next. And here's the data. This is more of a sort of classic eye tracking graph. So let's walk you guys through this. What we've got here, have a focus on the bottom left-hand corner graph, right? So just at the bottom of your screen where it says adults, and you can see on the y-axis, it says looks to 2 objects. And this is for trials where the 2 object has been mentioned. And you can see that 0 here is the onset of the word 2. And soon after the onset of the word 2, when the 2 object has been mentioned, adults look towards the object that has 2, and they look away from the object that has 1. And by the time about 800 milliseconds has passed from the onset of the word 2, they are mostly looking at the object that has 2 and rarely looking at the object that only has 1. And if you cast your eyes a little bit over to the right, you can see data from 4- to 5-year-olds, data from 3-year-olds, and data for 2-year-olds as well. And at every age, you can see that children are using the quantifier, the numerical quantifier, to predict which picture is going to be mentioned next. And I say predict, but this is a pretty weak form of prediction, right? You could almost do this task very easily. In fact, you could do this task very easily without ever really needing to have that final word mentioned. So even at 2 years, children can use semantic predictions to figure out what's going to be mentioned next. The question is, can they also predict the forms of the words that are going to come up? Right, so take a look at that middle row of graphs now, or upper row of graphs. Let's look at the adults again. Here, what you can see is looks towards the vowel initial object, like apple, when you've heard the quantifier or the indefinite article an. And you can see that it's a bit slower than the semantic prediction condition, but adults very robustly look towards the vowel initial object a few hundred milliseconds after hearing the quantifier an. So this suggests that adults are generating predictions about the forms of words that they're going to hear next. And that is completely consistent with a range of neuroscientific data that suggests that in adulthood, we predict not just the meanings of the words we're going to hear next, but also the forms of those words. The question is, do kids do that as well? And the answer is, with some tiny little wiggle room, but taking a look at the graph here, the basic answer is no. There's no evidence here that children are robustly generating these looks towards the vowel initial object as a function of hearing the indefinite article that predicts it. So unlike adults, children are not clearly predicting the forms of the words that they're going to hear next. They're predicting the semantics, but they're not predicting what they're going to hear. They predict what you mean, but they don't predict what you're going to say. So children generate linguistically sophisticated predictions about the meanings of words. Right, we know that from the first set of experiments that I told you about, but they're not predicting the precise forms that they're going to hear. And I would say that that is inconsistent with a sort of predictive coding account in which children are using predictions and prediction error to learn about the structure of their language. Right, so children predict meanings, they don't predict forms. last point. How does prediction relate to learning? So how does prediction explain children's learning development? And so I want to, focus again on these two theories of how prediction and learning might work together. So under the predictive coding account, there's sort of two things that you want to focus on when thinking about the relation between the sort of learning mechanism and children's outcomes. One is there should be a relationship between children's language outcomes and their ability to generate predictions. And the other is that there should be a relationship between children's language outcomes and their ability to calculate prediction errors and process prediction errors. So if we can measure both of these two things under a predictive coding account, you expect that they should both partially explain children's language development. By contrast, under the sort of catalytic view of prediction as a learning facilitator, the key thing is that what prediction is doing is that it's helping you to understand the world around you. Really, prediction here is just another form of processing speed. If you have strong skills at prediction, then you also have strong skills at processing the world around you. And so that's what's going to help you learn about the world. Prediction is just a way of making you faster and better. So to the degree that we see, so what we expect to see is that prediction skills should predict learning, but prediction error is not really important here. And the degree to which prediction explains learning should be overlapping with the degree to which other measures of, say, processing speed can explain learning. So that's a sort of like the baseline split. What we're going to look at is the degree to which children's vocabulary development relates to, 1, their skill at prediction, 2, their ability to generate prediction errors, and 3, another broader measure of their processing speed. And we're going to do that through an analysis of their ability to generate graded predictions. All right, so this is a sort of like somewhat basic experiment, but it produces data that's somewhat complicated. So I'll go through it in a bit of detail. So in this task, we've got another eye tracking task where children are listening to sentences and they see 3 objects on the screen that all could be potential continuations of the sentence, but some of which are more predictable than others. So for instance, you might see a bone and a pair of slippers and a pair of pajamas. And here the sentence, Alfie's dog likes to chew on the. And at that point in time, the bone is very predictable. Dogs love to chew on bones. But slippers are also quite predictable because dogs like to chew on slippers as well. And PJs are kind of predictable as well, but they're much less predictable because dogs don't stereotypically like to chew on pajamas. So from children's eye gaze or from adults' eye gaze, we expect to see a sort of graded pattern of looks where you mostly look towards the most predictable continuation and then partially look towards the less predictable and least look towards the continuation that is more or less unpredictable. And that is what you get. So this is another one of these sort of spaghetti plots. The y-axis, take a look at the graph on the left here. The y-axis here is gaze to those 3 pictures where the 0 point, which you can sort of see over on the right. The 0 point here is the point just before the target word, bone or slippers or pajamas, is actually mentioned. And we've got the relative gaze to those 3 pictures over time. And what you can see is that mostly people are looking towards the most predictable object. They're looking somewhat to the less predictable object, and they're looking least to the least predictable object. And this is data from a wide swathe of about 200 children. And you can see on the right-hand side how this develops between age 2 and age 5. At age 2, there's some evidence for graded predictions, but it is less precise. By age 3, there's a definite split. And by age 4 or 5, children show like nice adult-like splits between the most predictable, the least predictable, and the sort of middle predictable. So evidence for graded prediction in young kids. And this is going to be important for the sort of broader question because it's going to allow us to quite easily measure the relationship between prediction and learning. So Graded predictions are nice because they're a really sensitive measure of prediction. If I just tried to measure your ability to predict a word in context using some of the previous tasks, we get massive ceiling effects because those tasks are basically designed to be as sensitive as possible to whether you can predict, and they're not designed to measure like the amount of prediction you can do. Graded predictions, by contrast, provide variation that's going to allow us to more easily classify children into being good predictors, bad predictors, and so forth. Moreover, this graded prediction design allows us to sort of naturalistically actually measure prediction error. And I'll explain how in just a moment. And finally, this design also allows us to quite naturally measure processing speed. So how do we do that? So how do we measure prediction error first? Well, what we can do here is look to see how long it takes children to recognize words that are only partially predictable. So if we finish the sentence, Alfie's dog likes to chew on the slipper, well, slipper here is like slightly unpredictable because bone is the most predictable continuation. So the amount of time it takes you to recognize the word slipper and gaze towards the slipper in context is to some degree a measure of prediction error, and you can compare it to a sort of neutral baseline in order to get a sort of subtraction and a sort of prediction error score. So the neutral baseline is recognition of the word slipper in a context where none of the other objects are particularly predictable. And you can compare that to a bias condition where another object is more predictable. And from that, you get an estimate of prediction error, right? So prediction error is sort of the difference between this bias condition and the neutral condition. And from that same data, we can actually get a natural measure of sort of basic processing speed as well, which is the time it takes children to recognize words like slipper in neutral contexts that don't have any sort of predictive information at all, right? So word recognition for slipper in a neutral baseline is our basic measure of processing speed. So we're going to look to see how vocabulary development relates to these three things. So prediction skill, prediction error, and processing speed. That's our measure of prediction error. Sorry, that's our measure of prediction skill. Up at the top, it's the graded predictions, prediction error, and processing speed. And the learning we're going to predict is a sort of longitudinal increase in vocabulary, 7 months, in the 7-month period, roughly 7-month period, it varies by kid, after we measure children's prediction skills. So what we're going to do is we have a measure of children's vocabulary when we measure their prediction ability, and then we're going to look at those children again 7 months later, and we're going to try and assess the degree to which their vocabulary has increased in that intervening time, with the expectation that if prediction and prediction error and processing speed are all contributors to children's learning, then we should see a strong correlation between skill at these three domains and subsequent vocabulary development. But that's not quite what we see. So what you've got here is 3 graphs showing the relation between vocabulary growth on the y-axis and prediction skill on the left-hand side graph, prediction error measurement on the middle graph, and processing speed on the right-hand graph. So the prediction skill shows a significant positive correlation between your skill at prediction, the degree to which you show graded predictions, and your subsequent vocabulary development in the 7 months after testing. So kids who are good predictors at time 1, showed faster vocabulary growth in the intervening 7 months. By contrast, our measure of prediction error didn't capture any developmental change or any variation in children's vocabulary development. So children who are faster at recognizing that they've made a prediction mistake and refocusing on the named rather than the predicted object, that didn't predict their vocabulary change in the intervening 7 months, which is kind of inconsistent with a predictive coding account. By contrast, our measure of processing speed, so our measure of the ability with children's ability to recognize words in non-predictive contexts, that strongly predicted, again, their vocabulary development in the intervening months. Children who were faster, who took less time to fixate the named word on average, developed their vocabulary faster, which is why you get this sort of negative slope. So if you're a good predictor, your vocabulary develops more quickly. If you're a faster processor, your vocabulary develops more quickly. But if your sort of prediction error skills seem to be a little bit stronger, that doesn't seem to relate to your vocabulary development. So vocab development explained by prediction skill, explained by processing speed, but doesn't seem to be explained by prediction error. And interestingly, a sort of commonality analysis, essentially like a sort of fancy version of a regression, putting different predictors together, suggested that prediction skill and processing speed in this data was explaining the same sources of variance in children's vocabulary development. So it looks like, to the degree to which prediction and processing speed are explaining development, they're doing it in roughly the same way, consistent with this sort of catalytic idea that prediction is just another version of processing speed. So prediction then, but not the generation of prediction errors, seems to explain children's learning. All right, I'm going to sum up then. I began by talking about this beautiful unifying idea for perception and cognition, that language development might be driven by prediction error mechanisms in the same way that people maybe believe that like visual perception and language processing is driven by prediction error minimization. And I've suggested that might not be quite right. We find evidence that children do generate sophisticated predictions based upon linguistic structure, but that the predictions they're generating aren't detailed enough to be particularly useful for learning. We see minimal evidence for predictions about form. And second, I've suggested that measures of prediction error don't obviously predict children's learning outcomes, which is again evidence that expectation-driven language learning isn't quite right. Instead, I think the evidence better fits this idea that prediction is more of a catalyst for learning rather than a mechanism for learning itself. Children generate these lovely, sophisticated predictions about what people will talk about next that are going to be extremely useful for focusing their attention. And these predictions are frugal, right? That we're not trying to predict precisely what someone's going to say because we're not interested in precisely what they're going to say. We're interested in what they're going to talk about so that we can direct our attention appropriately. Right? You don't want to spend a lot of attentional resources predicting the precise sounds that someone is going to make. You want to devote your attentional resources to the more difficult tasks of learning. And these predictions that children make, their ability to make them, explains their learning outcomes later on, and it explains their learning outcomes in the same way as their processing speed skills predict their learning outcomes, again suggesting that prediction is really a catalyst, another form of processing speed that facilitates language learning by allowing other mechanisms to operate. So I shed a sad tear for this idea that prediction is a unifying theory that can explain all sorts of different aspects of processing and development and learning. But there's still a sort of happy outcome here where we have a better, more detailed, even if less inspiring understanding of how exactly prediction relates to children's language development. This idea then that it's a crutch, right? It's a catalyst that supports other learning mechanisms operate, sort of classical theories of heuristics that children use for word learning, processes of analogy and comparison that we can use for generating abstract grammar, processes for testing hypotheses. And moreover, these prediction skills can probably support children as they engage in well-coordinated interactions with the adults around them. So these coordinated interactions can act as a cradle for language development. And the fact that children have these prediction skills mean that they can interact socially with expertise early on in life. So it's not like prediction is an uninteresting explanation of children's language development. It explains a whole lot. But maybe it's not the case that prediction is as unifying a theory and as important a theory as the theory of evolution. Rather, it's just one little piece of the puzzle that explains children's language development. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rabagliati. That was a very interesting talk, and we have a couple of questions from our audience members. The first one, could it be possible that children are able to predict forms, but in the shown experiment, at that age, they're still not able to distinguish between the articles a and an?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a null result is a null result. And there's always going to be alternative explanations for it. We do worry that that is one possibility, that these like phonological links may not be quite precise enough for children to generate them at this point in time. By the time kids are 5, like, you know, they've been exposed to an awful lot of that. But there is this worry that to some degree, the sort of a-and distinction may be linked to literacy, right? So this is something that's really maybe more of a written rule than a spoken language rule. It is a spoken language rule because it is a written rule at this point in time, but it's maybe not quite precise enough for children to be able to show it here. So what would be great is if we had a better method, I think, for generating, for capturing children's expectations that didn't necessarily rely on this sort of like phonological reflexes here that are linked to the syntax and semantics. We don't have that right now. So I'm not quite sure, like, you know, what happened. So, you know, that question is to some degree still open. I think there's sort of varying possibilities. So, sorry, let me backtrack there slightly. I think it is quite possible that children can predict the phonology of the words that they're likely to hear, but that they do so on the basis of prior phonological information only, that these phonological predictions are encapsulated from semantic information to some degree, or grammatical information. So you might get phonological predictions within a word, like once you've heard the first couple of segments or the first syllable, you can predict subsequent syllables, subsequent phonemes, but you don't necessarily get these sort of larger hierarchical predictions where one word allows you to predict the phonology of another word, or one grammatical category allows you to predict the phonology of subsequent words.
Okay, another question, is prediction in children modulated by linguistic input in the context of interaction?
That's a great question. So it seems pretty likely that prediction skills are going to be partially dependent on the interactive context in which you're being used. But my suggestion would be that to a large degree, when we're engaged in like communicative interactions with kids, what we're often doing is minimizing the need for them to use prediction. Right? Prediction is something that's particularly helpful when you're in chaotic environments, trying to learn from someone who isn't necessarily directly trying to teach you, right? So there are lots of interactions that parents have with their kids, that caregivers have with their kids, that children have with other kids, where nobody is trying to teach them anything, but they're still having to learn about the language that's being used in the world that's all around them. And in those cases, prediction might be helpful because things are chaotic. By contrast, in sort of nice communicative interactions that parents have where you're sort of trying to sit down to read a book together or to play together and just talk, there you're really offering a lot of scaffolding so that prediction isn't necessarily that relevant. So you might sort of tamp down on the amount of prediction that you're doing. We don't have any evidence that this is true, right? We don't have any evidence that children are able to modulate the degree to which they're using resources to generate predictions or not based on the situation that they're in, but I think it's an interesting possibility.
Okay. Another audience member asked if the processes of language prediction are the same as the ones involved in L2 learners, or which aspects do you think would be different from those in L1 language prediction?
Sure. Okay. I'm going to farm out this question to my former postdoc, Chiara Gambi, who I mentioned right at the start of this talk, who has been investigating some of these very, very questions, and I think has some really interesting data that I'd love to tell you about, and that I know some of which is published in a recent paper in Cognition with me and Martin Pickering, and some of which I think she is trying to get published right now. So Chiara has lovely, lovely data suggesting that if you are an adult trying to learn vocabulary, it's actually really helpful to some degree to learn new vocabulary under conditions where the word is sort of heard unexpectedly. So if you are expecting one person to say a particular word, but then they say a novel word that you'd never heard about, that you'd never heard before in this situation, sort of similar to, an encounter that an L2 learner might have. This mismatch between your expectations and what actually encounter seems to boost your memory for these words subsequently. So you're better at remembering the meanings of words you're better at remembering the meanings of words if you encounter them in surprising situations. Across a large number of experiments now, Chiara has found evidence that kids do not show this effect. That when a child, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old encounters a novel word in a surprising context, that error signal doesn't give any boost to their memory for that word. So this is consistent with what I was talking about earlier, that prediction error is not something that necessarily drives learning and development in young kids, but it suggests that if you're an L2 speaker trying to learn novel vocabulary, some of the principles of prediction-driven learning really may be sort of more operative up there.
Okay, another question. Why does vocabulary growth improve prediction if vocabulary growth causes interference in the selection of lexical candidates?
Ooh, okay. So, so this is an interesting point, and I guess the question is, to what degree does vocabulary growth cause interference between the selection of lexical candidates versus is vocabulary growth a necessary consequence of learning a necessary predictor of lexical organization and retrieval? If you are someone with a limited vocabulary, you're not going to be able to predict very well. You're going to get all your predictions wrong, right? If you only know the names of a few animals and you're trying to predict what names people are going to say when they go to the zoo, you're going to get that wrong more often than not. So you're going to end up disheartened and discouraged and not necessarily learning very much or being able to understand very much or being very fluent. By contrast, when you have a large vocabulary, even if it might be a little harder for you to search for that word, you're going to be able to ultimately generate more sort of vocabulary items. And more broadly, though, sort of interference between vocabulary items in comprehension is sort of, it's an interesting issue, the degree to which we do see a lot of interference there, especially in predictive contexts. And that's going to partially depend upon the structure of the lexicon and the domains of the lexicon that you've got expertise within, right? If you think about how the lexicon is organized, both in the mind and also as a sort of cultural object that's evolved over time. The lexicon is something that has evolved for communicative efficiency as much as possible. So being able to easily recall words whilst also being expressive in the concepts that we use. So I would sort of suggest that, to the degree that there is interference between lexical items, it's not as big as it potentially could be.
And is it possible to train prediction?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have done experiments trying to get people to be stronger predictors or worse predictors. We did it by, for example, getting people to speak out loud, thinking that would be, so this was adults rather than with kids. So we were getting folk to try and interpret sentences by shadowing them verbally versus just reading them, trying to find evidence that you could thereby increase the amount of prediction that you were doing. And this sort of draws upon a theory that my colleague and collaborator Martin Pickering has put forward, the idea that prediction to some degree is multi-mechanism. So you can generate predictions based on sort of like lexical associations and semantic memory, but you can also generate predictions by what he calls engaging the production system, which is what you use to generate structured predictions. So when you talk, when you are listening to someone, you're kind of shadowing in your head what you think they are going to say by using the same mechanisms that you use to generate new words. And that's what allows you to predict what they're going to say next. And we found sort of inconclusive evidence that engaging the production system in this regard leads to stronger predictions. But that doesn't mean that you can't boost the production system in other ways. So other folk have shown that if you give people verbal interference tasks, so you get them to sort of shadow by saying like da, 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 as they're listening to sentences, then that really decreases their ability to predict. Well, it doesn't necessarily decrease their ability to understand. So there is, some evidence, therefore, that prediction is modifiable through different strategies, and therefore it seems quite likely that prediction is something that's trainable.
And we have one last question. Would it be correct to say that children can predict illogical words, and as they grow, those relationships become more fixed? And if so, can it be related to the natural use of imagination?
Sorry, what sort of words can children predict?
Illogical words.
Can children predict illogical words? Not quite sure I understand what's meant by illogical here, but I can riff on it if you like. So you mean sort of meanings that we wouldn't normally expect people potentially to have. I don't know, maybe that's like a sort of close regard to what you might mean here. So maybe children could predict meanings that we wouldn't necessarily expect adults to use. My feeling, based on sort of the evidence, is that actually children's expectations about what we're going to talk about are surprisingly logical, right? You rarely see, you do notice kids predicting things or thinking that words have meanings that they do not have in a language. But it's rare that you encounter children generating predictions about the meanings of words that seem completely disjoint from what a standard word in English or Spanish or Italian or Chinese would have. Rather, sort of predictions, to the extent that they're wrong, they're just like mildly incorrect. You don't see kids predicting like that you'll have, words like grew that mean, green before today and blue after today or something like that. So I don't see much evidence that children predict illogically. I do think there's a really interesting question about the relationship between prediction and imagination, and that we don't know an awful lot about. To be honest, we don't know an awful lot about the sort of cognitive psychology of imagination in children generally, and I think that's a fascinating thing to investigate.
Sorry, if I can have a question before we finish.
Please.
I was just wondering, in your study where you concluded that children can predict semantically but not forms, and you were saying that probably literacy is a factor. I was wondering if syntax is a factor, not like the whole component of literacy. So I was wondering if maybe children who have a better score in syntactic tasks can perform this task at given age than children that have a poor syntactic skill. I don't know, what do you say?
Yeah, so I can imagine that something like that might hold, but that indefinite article alternation we were using, a versus an, it doesn't have like a grammatical reflex, right? It doesn't have like different grammatical forms. So I don't know whether, for that particular task, grammatical knowledge would affect it. And looking at that data, one thing that was very obvious was that it was a total flat line. It wasn't like there was some subgroup of like smarter kids who were getting it right and the rest of them weren't. It was just like nobody in there understood it. But I do think that you're right, that grammatical knowledge is going to play an important role in sort of learning to generate potentially more detailed predictions. I mean, it does look as though once you are an adult, you have developed the skill to use, say, grammatical knowledge to predict form. It just doesn't necessarily seem to be there when you're a little kid, or at least not in these behavioral studies.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, we thank all the audience, and of course, thank you, Hugh. We hope to have you next in the future, either in this format online, or we would love to have you in person, of course.
I would love to see you guys again next time I visit Mexico City. It's a beautiful, beautiful place.
Thank you so much.
All right, I have to run and pick up my little kid from nursery. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hugh. Okay, Ron.